They never saw their parents, family, or homeland after the age of 8. They were captured in the middle of the night by a fellow countryman raiding small villages. They were chained together, and if they survived beatings and dehydration during the trip to a port, they were stored with thousands of others in caged barracks, awaiting a dangerous transatlantic voyage to an unknown world. This story I just shared is about those nameless slaves whose remains lie underneath downtown Portsmouth in an estimated 200 graves, unmarked, in the area of Chestnut Street. Yes, that's right, just 12 miles down the road in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. At the peak of the slave trade around 1767, there were 187 African slaves in Portsmouth. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery was still going on here in New Hampshire. And it wasn't until 1857 that New Hampshire passed an act basically ending slavery. In 2003, while the city was doing some routine road work, that long-forgotten burial ground in Portsmouth was discovered. There's now this memorial, as you see here, in its place to remind us of that burial ground. Slavery in Hampshire? This came to a surprise to me when I first heard and read about it, and as I was preparing for the sermon, learned even more about what was going on during that time. And we think here, living in New Hampshire, that slavery might have been a more southern problem, that we're separated from that. But as we've heard this morning, racial issues continue beyond the 1700s and even into today. This sermon is about racism and white privilege. And it might make some folks in this room a little uncomfortable. And I'm going to acknowledge that I'm going to be a little uncomfortable. And truthfully, it should make us all a little uncomfortable. Now, I started my journey as becoming an anti-racist, and I use that term very frankly, which is someone who confronts racial inequalities. Back in 2015. In 2015, Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson, Missouri. The racial tensions that grew out of that event brought national media attention. And it was during that time that I read a series of articles in the New York Times by Nicholas Kristof called "When Whites Just Don't Get It." And as the title suggests, that it stung. You know, you read about it and it made me think. It made me to think and dig deeper, to start working towards racial justice. And that journey keeps going even today. Recently, I joined the Commission on Race and Religion, which is a conference-level committee. And they help to educate clergy and lay people in the conference about the issues of race and having those conversations on race. Now, racism and racial injustice shapes all of our lives and plays a part in all of our relationships with one another. We don't need to look at who is racially different from us and how to transform that relationship. But we need to look beyond and look at ways that transform the unjust systems and disrupt our own involvement in those unjust structures. Racism stems from a long history of systems of injustice built on oppression. The civil rights movement didn't solve the problem of racism, and just because we don't necessarily see it every day doesn't mean it still doesn't happen. Clearly, we have some work still to do. Racism can show up in a number of ways in a number of different places. For example, a person crosses the street to avoid walking next to a group of young black men. A person calls 911 to report the presence of a person of color who is otherwise behaving normally and lawfully. Our own white privilege is another way that racism can be maintained. People of color face challenges unlike us of those who are white. School districts can provide majority white school districts with more funding than those that are non-white school districts. Banks provide loans at higher interest rates to people of color. A friend of mine who is a person of color told me recently that if she had financed her car through the normal bank channels, the interest rate would have been in the double digits, even with a great credit score. She ended up taking a personal loan at almost 9% and was quite happy about that. And I was just dumbfounded, awestruck. The national average for a 60-month loan is a little over 5%. I'm like, how could that be? A Berkeley study found that even when black borrowers applied for mortgages online, they were charged interest rates that were 5 to 8% higher than the normal rate. So how can we put these words in action to show hope to this world? As Mark Miller wrote, "How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? How long, O God, must we feel like outsiders, strangers in a strange land, a people held captive by fear, abuse of power, prejudice, and unjust systems? How long, O God, must we be in fear for our children who are growing up in a world of terror and violence? How many people in our country need to be killed until we muster the will and the courage to stop the madness? We long for your justice, for your peace, O God. We long to be released from these shackles of fear and injustice. And until that time, we cry out with that psalmist saying, how long? But I want to challenge that lament as well and move us to action. And I applaud the fact that we've started having conversations around race, because it is indeed uncomfortable. And those conversations need to continue. But I ask, though, that we think about doing more than just talking about it. And we need to turn towards showing up for racial justice. And it can be challenging. And I'll admit, it takes time and energy that sometimes even I feel difficult to find. Our charge as people of faith is to both throw down against white supremacy and to join with black leadership to build up a world our children and elders deserve. We are asked to build up an inclusive, beloved community, something that Dr. King emphasized. We have to make a choice on which side of history we want to be on: the history of slavery, genocide, and lynching, or the history of people coming together to build what Anne Braden calls the other America, the America of multiracial democracy and equality for all people, the America of the abolitionists, the freedom riders, and the dream defenders. So you might be asking yourself, what can I do? How can I get involved? So glad you asked. We can take steps to start disrupting the cycle of racism and work toward getting rid of racial injustice. And these are just a few examples to enable us to become anti-racist, to become true allies. When we work towards racial justice, it means that we work with other individuals and groups to help change laws, policies, and practices that reinforce and continue these racial disparities. It means striving for equitable outcomes for people of color. We can help make a difference by looking critically at these systems like predatory lending and racial profiling. Even just voting for those that support these types of efforts in public office can go a long way. We can educate ourselves in the history and backstories of racial oppression here in the United States, where that racial oppression is still seen and felt today. Now, it took a major event like Ferguson to make me more aware of what's going on. But we don't have to wait for another major event to move us, to persuade us to take action. The more people work, and the more people that work towards breaking down those systems of racial injustice, the more impact there is. This work will help us all move towards that dream of inclusive, beloved communities. God calls us to active participation in unity and not passive waiting for unity to just happen. With God's help, we can start to disrupt the laments of the psalmist of how long? How long? Amen.